So this is going this is going to be a three-part session here. Yes. You can't hear me? Is this okay? Okay. Okay, so this is going to be a three-part session, and on the tables I distributed some discussion questions. And the purpose of this, not everyone has one, but it's to try and make you make some connections with what actually goes on in your classroom or in your homeschool situation. Just so I know who I'm talking to, how many are school or classroom teachers here? Okay, and then homeschoolers? Okay, and then pastors who just are here because they have nothing else to do on a Sunday morning. Great. I really want to try and tie this in with some practical, how do I know if what I'm doing is the right thing type question. So at the end of the session, I want to kind of focus it, because a lot of times I found when I was in the classroom, I'm looking at something and I'm trying to think, well, is this appropriate or is it not appropriate? Is this classical or is it not classical? Or is it neutral? And so I always found that to be a problem, and maybe you've experienced that yourself. If it just because it comes out of a publishing house that has the word classical to it, does that make it good for a Lutheran classical school? And just because it has the name Lutheran on it, does that make it good for a Lutheran classical school? It's very confusing. The confusion, I think, is not unique just to people who have experience. When I have the Lutheran LTE students, so I have all the LTE students for the class called Catechesis in the Lutheran School. I start with a question about the nature of educational theory. And I'll say all educational theory is shaped by theology. Do you agree or disagree? And most will disagree, because it is a common understanding that educational theory is in some way theologically neutral, especially in this so-called secular age when it appears that people don't have any theology at all. It would all appear to be very neutral. But then when I say, well, what about your own approach to education? Your own educational theory, your own pedagogy, is that shaped by your theology? They'll go, oh yes, of course. And I will say, well, why is it that person X who's working in a state university isn't shaped by their theology, but you are? And that kind of makes them scratch their head a little bit. That question about theology is one of the key things that I think we as Lutherans should be asking ourselves. When Luther wrote about against Erasmus, he says, what we are doing is grabbing the goose by the neck. That is looking at theology, not just looking at the externals. So we should always be asking the question, what does a person teach, believe, and confess? That is a quintessential Lutheran question. The person who's writing this stuff, the person who's come up with this stuff, what do they teach, believe, and confess? And that, in large part, will tell me if what they're projecting out into the classroom is good or bad. Theology shapes methods, not just what we teach. So it isn't just a matter of content. And I think this is where we kind of run into problems, and which is probably most common in Christian schools and Lutheran schools. They'll say, well, we just make sure we have the Bible. We just make sure we have the good content in there. But also the methods are shaped by what we teach, believe, and confess. That question really isn't unique to our time. It has been the standard for Christian education going back to the earliest times. It was always understood that theology expresses itself in a particular way, and that one of the particular ways is in the realm of pedagogy and how one teaches and the methods one uses. So what a person teaches, believes, and confesses becomes the first and most important question. In the 16th century, there's my favorite educator, Valentin Friedland Trotzendorf. He's just, aside from having the coolest name in Lutheran education, I mean, who wouldn't want a headmaster named Trotzendorf, right? He's really interesting. He's extremely orthodox. Extremely orthodox? No, I think you're only orthodox. But he's also an innovator in education. He's trying all sorts of really interesting things in the classroom, and he reorganizes his school. They're called the Goldberg School Rules, and he reorganizes it and comes up with this neat way of running a school. That said, he said, those who belong to our school, meaning the teachers, let the same also be members of our church, and those who agree with our faith, which is most sure and true, because of perhaps one godless person out of the whole body some evil happens. So he recognizes that a person's personal confession really does affect what goes on in the school. However, we come to believe that now the contrary is true. It doesn't matter what a person teaches, believes, and confesses. It's only the outcomes. It's only the results that count. And I guess that's kind of a typical American approach to things. It's, well, what's the outcome? What are the effects? So according to this principle, education can be structured according to a researcher's scientific theories and principles with little regard to what they teach, believe, and confess. Now, all of that is really a result of 19th and 20th century, which presented the image of a dispassionate scientist dressed in a white lab coat coming up with an ideal model, one that could be conducted without any influences of personal biases and theological opinions. This assumption that research, including educational research, is a matter of scientific discovery alone, of studying everything in an atheological way, is presented. But is it truly possible for a scientist to operate in that way? I would argue not. The work of Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking should be sufficient to put an end to that argument, for they are in no way theologically neutral. Their theories are directly shaped by their confessions that there is no God and that we are masters of our destiny. So, if that's true for a harder science, that it's not affected by a person's biases, how much more is it true for the sciences of social science? Here indeed, people's confessions shape what they advocate. Research in these sciences, which deal with human behavior, will always be influenced by what the investigator believes, teaches, and confesses. And very often, the argument for using the most modern methods of education goes something like this: research has shown, right? And whenever you hear research has shown, I think, well, it probably reveals more about the researcher than what they are researching. And so it's normative now to have research-based education dominating teacher formation. And so we have this model to say, well, a person's theology doesn't matter because research has shown that this is true. With each new study comes the promise that the newest method will increase student learning and student engagement. One would assume that with all the research that has gone on and the billions of dollars that have funded it, education would have made enormous progress and our students would be smarter than ever. We should be crawling with geniuses all over the place. Students today who have been beneficiaries of such prodigious research should be better read, more thoughtful in their discourse, wiser in their deliberations, and more intent on pursuing the virtuous life. However, in considering the vulgarity of mass entertainment and popular culture, the level of political and civic discourse that is exhibited in our current political structure system today, one is hard pressed to make the case that funding all this research has been well spent. So why has it all, I shouldn't say why has it all failed. I'll say it. Why has it all failed? In response to this, the argument research has shown, I would say that we've ignored what the researchers teach and believe and confess. If I myself reject that children are born as sinful human beings, then I will look for some other explanation for their bad behavior. I'll probably be inclined to remove the guilt and the blame from the child and throw it on the parents, or throw it on the community, or throw it on some other group other than that child. The point is this, that what a philosopher or an educationalist believes and confesses dictates not just the type of questions they will ask, but also the explanations they will propose for their questions. So what I want to do over the next sessions is look at that question and how the beliefs shape the materials that we are given. I will demonstrate that those two things are inextricably linked, and show that an educational model cannot be uncritically used without importing a belief system or the model that it's constructed upon. And I hope to give you some tools then to decipher what is going on behind the scenes. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk for about 10 more minutes, and then we're going to have some discussion about this, okay? So, here's the thing that I encountered. When you start saying anything negative about one particular model of education or one particular theory that's proposed, people will invariably say, well, are you saying they're all wrong? Are you saying that everything they've been teaching is absolutely bad? And if you think honestly about what is advocated, you can't answer yes to that. I mean, we may want to, but we can't. So if we have to say there's some good things in there, how do we know if the good things that we see are really good? How do we know that? How can we separate good practices and methodology from the bad theology? How can we identify which is what? How do we know what is good? How do we know what we should and should not use in our classroom? Are group discussions all wrong? Are group projects wrong? Should we have individual research assignments? Well, I would say, and here I'm going to take the lead just on how we do theology in the Lutheran Church, is that we take our lead by looking at the practices and methods used by earlier Christian teachers. So just as in the church, we stand in the long line of saints, right? We are part of the long line. We don't approach theology like Baptists, in which we just say the Bible, and we ignore everything that's gone on and everyone that's gone before us, and we just skip back over the centuries and go to the Bible. No, we are in line with what the church has always taught. We are in line with what the church has always practiced. And so when the Reformation came, they didn't seek to throw out everything that the Romans used. No, they kept that which was in line with church practice and in line with Scripture, right? That's kind of how we do things. Well, I would say that same paradigm really works well when it comes to what we do in the classroom. We don't want to throw everything out, but in order to determine what we should keep, we go back through the centuries and we say, am I teaching in line with what everybody else has been doing? So I kind of going to give you 3 different paradigms here, 3 different scenarios. So, I can't write on that. Don't worry, usually we have white or smart boards that say do not use these markers on it, and I usually see the sign after I've written on it. It's like, oh. Okay, so let's say practice A. C, right? I always get C and S confused, right? So practice A. Here you have a situation where 20th century, 21st century, whatever, pick your century. In the 21st century, you have a theory, a model that's saying X is good. Okay? Now, I can go back to, no, I'll put this up here, 21st century, then you go to earlier Christian pedagogues, and they say X is good as well, right? You got that? So, for example, currently, corporal punishment is frowned upon in popular education, right? So, should we agree with that or disagree with that? Why? Now I put you on the spot. So you said yes. Anything else? Yeah.
I say it depends on who the child is. I mean, I'm a homeschooler, so if I choose to use corporal punishment in my classroom, then I have the right to do so. And I shouldn't be told by someone else that I shouldn't because they're my children.
Okay.
And so, thus, if I put my kids in a school, then I'm handing the authority over to the school in which to discipline in the way that they say so. So if that school agrees with corporal punishment, then I am saying that they may do so simply because I put my child in their school. So I say that it's up to the parent, and if they choose to send their kid to a school, then they have to realize that they're giving up the right to make the choice.
Okay. Now, so if we go back here and say, well, what did these guys say? Interestingly enough, they almost universally said in the school, not in the home, but in the school, corporal punishment should not be practiced. Luther said, in the most extreme case, you may choose to use it. But universally, they all say no. Why? Because corporal punishment is antithetical to inducing the pleasure of learning. You don't want to associate the pleasure and the joy of learning with punishment. So in that case, I may say, yeah, I agree with this, right? Now, I'm not taking my lead off of these guys. I'm taking my lead off of these guys, and now I can say, okay, this is how we're going to carry out discipline in the school. Corporal punishment actually doesn't come along until the Pietists. Because the Pietists, I mean, you can always blame the Pietists for everything, but the Pietists were interested in mortifying the flesh, and they had this idea of progress, and you should be able to, discipline a child so that they progress spiritually, and that translates into the classroom as well. So, Pietists invented clocks in the classroom too. they were concerned about making the use of every moment of the time. And so it's Franca who puts big hourglasses in every classroom with a warning underneath to children that they dare not waste a second or a single sand of time, right? That they had to use every single moment to God's glory. So that's an example where sometimes what we see going on, we can actually agree with. Now, having said that, they weren't, the earlier guys were saying it for a different reason than today. Today it's because they're all talking about the psychological well-being of a child. The earlier Christian pedagogues are saying no, because this is antithetical to true learning, what we want a child to associate learning with. Okay?
So where was spare the rod and spoil the child? Is that part of the Bible?
Did you say what?
What about spare the rod and spoil the child?
They
Is that in the Bible?
never associate corporal punishment with the classroom. They will say, okay, that's the parent's domain, right? So, but even there, you'll find injunctions saying, don't abuse this authority. They're very, use it sparingly, right? Right. Right, and I think that blows this whole myth out of the water where children were, beat incessantly in schools. Okay, practice B. Here's another situation. And here's this is an easier one, where in the 21st century, they say a practice is bad, but the earlier Christian pedagogues say it's good. Well, if they contradict the established tradition of Christian education, then it's pretty easy to say, yeah, now I know that these people are wrong. So can you think of an example? Memorization, that's actually what I have written down on my paper, where memorization is bad. Now, part of the reason why they say memorization is bad, and Dewey and friends are big on this, is because they want to cut children off from history. They want to cut them off from their past. And memorization has everything to do with connecting to the past. But so earlier Christian pedagogues, memorization is at the heart and core of learning. Having said that, there are also injunctions to not go overboard with it. They always say, but a wise teacher knows not to overload his students with too much memory work. So that's an easy one. Pardon? Right. Yeah. Sure.
They think it's bad now because your reality is not what the child's needing, so you're influencing that. No, you need to teach them what is true, good.
Right, and so she was just saying direct instruction. Excellent example. Practice C. My chart's all off. Here's a situation where these people say good, but the early Christian pedagogues don't say anything. So it's not where they're contradicting, it's not where they're agreeing, it's where they didn't say anything about it. Now, can you come up with an example for that one? Well, sure, technology, right. Any other examples? Like, is it good or bad to use in the classroom? Yeah.
Sharing your feelings. Sharing your feelings. I don't think the other said that was good or bad. It kind of had nothing to do with education, but it sure said to be good now.
Now you got me thinking. Yeah, I know, it drives me crazy, especially, and you know, in the university setting, when a student says, I feel that Luther is wrong here. And I say, I don't care about your feelings, right? I want to know what you know. No, my feelings.
I wonder perhaps creativity as the supreme educational virtue. Creativity.
Well, no, because that would more fall into that category, and I'm thinking the centering it on feelings. And you gotta, you know, I always say teachers have been good teachers have been good teachers have been good teachers. They're all the same. And so I don't think there's ever been a good teacher who has stopped a child from, you know, expressing joy or sadness or frustration or whatever have you. And there isn't, what was your suggestion? Over here?
Oh, I said, well, also I can't see the bottom category, but
Yeah.
what does that say?
Question mark.
Okay. No, I didn't derail. Perhaps I misunderstood what you were, what sort of feedback you were soliciting.
Yeah, but what did you say?
Well, I said, well, I mean, not just creativity on the part of the teacher is construed as, you know, a supreme good, but, you know, the best thing a student can be is creative. You just really want them to be creative.
Right. And there too, there's no way you're going to find good teachers who stifle creativity
Right.
in history ever. I mean, good teachers are good teachers. And so that's kind of one of those false accusations that get thrown out, and it's just not true. It doesn't hold up. I'm thinking more in the term of like the technology question. Yeah.
I wonder if the practice of like social promotion, it might fit in this category where it wouldn't have occurred
Right.
to the early Christian teachers. They would never thought of it. But now that's, you know, still considered more important for the child to be with their social group, whether they can handle the work, whether they learned anything. You know, let's graduate that basketball player on time, so he can play in college and go to the NBA.
No, I'm going to throw that up to in this category, because it's you can the motive for doing it is clearly wrong. Why they're talking about social promotion, and that's you'll have to come back tomorrow for that one.
How about standardized tests?
Standardized tests might be one good. That's an excellent example. Do you have standardized tests or not? You're not going to. That's a case where you're trying to read into what goes on in the past, and then we have to start drawing on our own foundation and come up with the new answers. I think not the social promotion, but the whole social connectivity question in education is something that is unique to our time. So how do we use that? How do we use peer-to-peer learning in a classical setting? That you can't go back to the past and say, well, this is how they did peer-to-peer, right? I don't think they really envisioned Wittenberg Academy back in the 1600s. There's someone else had their hand up.
What about having boys and girls in the same classroom?
That's another good one, yeah. I don't know of any record in history where they had co-ed classrooms. Anyone else in the? No. So that's a question where, is that the best appropriate approach or not? Okay, so it's crummy diagram, I know. Just really, I'm crummy at chalkboards and whiteboards. But if you can have that kind of paradigm going forward as we start to look at two groups, and the two groups I'm going to look at are the Gnostics and the Marxists. And those are kind of the two major dominant groups that are at work in education today. So if you want to do a little bit of research overnight, is have a look at the Gnostics and what Gnosticism is. And by the way, an excellent, excellent book is Peter Burfeen's Gnostic America. Has anyone read that? Yeah, yeah. It gets kind of heavy at times, but I think Peter does an excellent job at bringing out Gnosticism. And he relates it to education a lot and the need for classical education, though he doesn't use that term. And maybe look at what modern day Marxism neo-Marxism looks like today and how that works out. And that, if you have those two paradigms, you're going to be able to see a lot of, this is coming from this background, I don't want to use it, right? It may look like it falls into this category, but it doesn't because of what they teach, believe, and confess. Any comments or questions? We're done a little bit early. Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you just move closer to the microphone? With the fans and everything on the outskirts, it's just difficult to hear.
Well, I'm almost at the end. Sorry. Yeah.
On your diagram, how about the good and the bad? I mean, I guess that's kind of obvious what the Bible says in it earlier.
Oh, so it would be like,
Good and bad. I mean, I just see that as
21st century.
really standing out in our culture right
you mean like that?
now. Yeah, like homosexuality is bad, and everything is called good.
Yeah, sure. I was kind of putting those two together, trying to make it positive in a postmodern way.
Could you actually hold the microphone where that cramped your style a bit too much?
You want me to hold it?
Would you mind? Because
I
every
don't
time
mind.
you step away, they can't hear you on the side.
Yeah. I just feel like Drew Carey on Price is Right. That's all. I really don't do well with microphones at all. Yeah.
So with all the, I guess, the different curriculums and different teaching models, everything that is out there right now, can we say that classical education works for every child? Because everything is about differentiation now and thinking in the child. So how do we combat that? Or what would we say?
Well, I think you have to define classical and works. So if you're going to define works according to most modern educational standards, you would say, no, it doesn't work, right? Because they would say, well, everyone learns in a different way. However, and this is in line with what every earlier Christian pedagogue says, you should be teaching in a variety of ways too. And if you've been in classical classrooms, there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of singing, a lot of motions, a lot of jingles, a lot of variety in what's going on. So from the outside, they would say, no, it can't work for everybody. But in reality, if you look at how earlier people talked, my favorite example is Erasmus. And for young children, he advocated things like baking biscuits in the form of letters and arranging them into words. Or my even more favorite is an archery practice. And you cut out letters and then they would shoot arrows at the letters and spell words. And it's like, ooh. I don't know how well that would go over in cities like Chicago, arming children in classical school, but it's anything but dry education. It's anything but it's saying, oh, you don't use any interesting methods or any interesting activities. Or Augustine is he's brimming with excitement over things you can do in the classroom. You know, and this is a model that's been foisted on us to say real education didn't start until the Enlightenment, right? And I've taken the history of ed courses, and they'll kind of do a session on ancient Greece and Rome, and then they'll skip forward to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? The father of modern education, and how much he brought, and they completely ignore what's gone on before. Yeah.
I noticed that something, in trying to advocate for classical education, it can be very tempting to, I don't know who made the earlier comment, to say, yeah, classical education will do everything that your progressive model does, but it'll do it better. Rather than, I mean, you know, is it true that you know, logical reasoning, well, you know, will be better after classical education, or some, you know, outcome that's considered desirable, you know, by the progressive model? Well, yes, but then very often you can get people who are they still have the outcome-based education mentality, and they're sort of waiting for the delivery of all of those things that they wanted from the progressive model, but the classical model is going to kind of like do that better. And of course, that's a very real. It's incidentally true. So often when you say it, you know, and it's heard as like a general thing, you know,
Right.
about everything, then you might get, you know, maybe interest in the program that is then, you know, frustrated because, well, where are all my, you know, my benchmarks that I was expecting, you know, rather than, yeah, some of those things are going to be the same, but not all of the goals. Seriously, not all the goals are going to be the same.
Good point. Excellent point. One of the things that just came to mind as you were talking is, and I think this is a danger for us in the classroom, is our eyes are so much on the state-run education, the government-run education, that we say, well, if it's classical, it must be okay, without saying, yeah, but the people that are developing the classical material, what is their theology? So the Reform have done a lot of work in classical education, and they have a lot of material out there, but you don't want to import Reform theology through the back door and stop asking the question, well, what do they teach, believe, and confess? Because I say if we just use all that approach and all that material, we're just going to end up with Reform Lutherans who know how to speak Latin, and we don't want that either. So just because it says Christian in classical doesn't necessarily make it good. And I think for homeschoolers, it's doubly difficult in this regard because we don't have a lot of good material out there. There just aren't we don't have the same number of support groups. We don't have the same number of books and resources and curriculum. And so it's easy just to start using this stuff and say, well, there, it's Christian and it's classical and therefore it's okay. You still have to ask the question, what do they teach, believe, and confess? Yeah.
Pretty new to all this, and so I know I'm going to get questions from parents and others that are concerned of how we implement this and what does this classical Lutheran education discount or somehow, is it the opposite of the liberal arts education? Is it, explain that to me.
No.
No, you won't explain it?
It is a liberal arts education. That's how I respond to parents. I said, this is how Christians have always taught their children. It's the world that says, this is how you should teach your children. But your world does not want your child to spend eternity with Christ, right? That's a short answer. Okay, who's the timekeeper here? Am I the timekeeper?
Yes.
You are? Oh, okay. So we're gonna end this. Okay. We're gonna cut this off here, and tomorrow we're going to look at the Gnostic background and how that bubbles up in some of the material, and then we're going to look at the secularist, the Marxist, the socialist influence. Okay? Great.